Welcome to the Cyber Call, the podcast by Ride of Boom for managed service providers looking to stay ahead in an ever-changing world of cybersecurity. Each week, we dive into the latest threats, trends, and real-world strategies to help MSPs protect their clients and grow their businesses. Let's build a safer, stronger community together.
It's great to have you all with us here. We just missed the Ides of March. You remember that Shakespearean stuff, John, when we were in school, the Ides of March? The 16th, not the
Hardly, but yes.
So as always, before we get into today's session, as people start to join us, we'll do some screen sharing, some banter before we, like I said, introduce our guests. Ali, let's talk about your blog first, right? So, you know, we know everybody's aware the strikes on Iran. Everybody's aware the retaliation to, I shouldn't say everybody, retaliations to AWS. And then we inadvertently bomb a school and an absolute tragedy, killing a number of children. Very quickly, you know, Iran strikes back and goes after Stryker. My question to you, just gut feel, Ali, in all the research you've done over the years, are these back doors set already? I mean, you know, Stryker's not a fledgling type organization that has a makeshift security program. I mean, this is all, probably arguably a Fortune 100, maybe a Fortune 200 company. What's your thoughts here on how quickly that was done, how effectively? I mean, literally shut down the entire company. So what's your thoughts here?
It's really interesting. Yeah. Based on what they've said, Fortune 300, I think is what they're specifying. They actually mentioned that in the latest post, which is kind of funny. But this is a great question, because one of the things that I was thinking about as this was happening was like, that happened quickly. Like, that was a pretty quick turnaround on this, especially for such a large company after the initial strikes. Honestly, it's difficult to know until we get the after action report, of course, but there's every possibility that they were pre-positioning, and like most nations, they are pre-positioning actively, and especially in situations where there's a potential wartime scenario approaching. We've all known that this was coming for a while, so it's not a surprise that they would be pre-positioning, but we don't have any evidence to that end, at least not at this point. But I'd love to kind of get some other perspectives in here too, given y'all's background.
Yeah, for sure. John, let me jump over to you, who tracked Iran for, that's what you did specifically at the NSA. Obviously, you also running Blackpoint. I know your intel team certainly didn't take your foot off the gas and looking at nation state threat actors. Gut feel is, you have a lot of experience tracking this adversary.
Yeah. So, I went after the guys trying to build the implosion system for their nuclear weapon and all that type of stuff. Probably had more offensive cyber runtime in my role at Blackpoint. But again, nation states aren't hitting MSPs at like a massive level. They do it when there's some part of the supply chain that's critical. Like we had the Chinese go after, a part for a spacecraft, and they tried to steal that. We blocked them. But I think in this, I said it last week, what's your opinion around cyber capabilities? I said they're probably really similar to a top tier ransomware group. A lot of live off the land type stuff, dual use stuff. My guess is either they already had credentials to Microsoft 365 specifically for admin, or it's pretty easy to trick people and steal them if you do, and that can be if you have compelling content. What I've read, Intune was involved. If you have access and ability to control Intune, you can do whatever you want. You win. So, like getting domain admin on, kind of your on-prem environments and becoming admin in a Microsoft 365 environment where you use Intune to deploy. I mean, it's perfect for everything. And I think be a pretty simple attack if you have that access, to be honest.
Fair. Kelvin, let's jump over to you. Just a quick tangent, if you would. Certainly mention what you want here on Stryker, but you heard some things about MSP tools recently before coming on here regarding Iran. And can you give your thoughts here? And
yeah, so about the Stryker thing, it's absolutely amazing how how non-sophisticated and how much impact the attack actually had, because all they did all that we can assume so far, of course, is domain admin credentials were leaked somehow, global admin credentials were leaked somehow, and they did an Intune wipe. That's all they did. So the sophistication of the attack is it's the simplest thing you could do. Select all devices, wipe device. Period. That's it. So that's kind of crazy, and it's crazy that they had accounts with that kind of privilege available. But that's an entirely different story. It just shows that even enterprises have difficulties managing access control and these kind of things. Enterprises as large as them. It's not just unique to the MSP world. And I was recently talking to someone at the Defender team at Microsoft, and they were specifically saying that there's a list of nation-state attackers that are specifically targeting MSP-based software. And the most popular software is in that list. Think of RMM tools. But I was surprised because the only reason I heard was because SIP was also in this list. So they're thinking of the nation-state attackers are thinking of much more than just, I'm going to attack an RMM and get control of these devices. They're looking at identity and M365 and all of these things as just another avenue to attack. It's kind of crazy to think of how they're looking at our tools because we have so much far-reaching access, and then combining that with the cybersecurity poverty line that a lot of MSPs are under. It's a very scary thought.
Phyllis, close us. Yeah, go, Ali, please go.
Yeah, it's interesting too because, of course, like if we look at the group claiming responsibility with Handala hackers, like they pose as a hacktivist group, but it's much more likely that they are just solely posing that way and that they are actually affiliated with Iran in a pretty serious way, if not one of the core Iranian threat groups out there. And to me, the speed at which they were able to execute on this attack after the strikes is just further evidence of that, because there's no way that a hacktivist group is going to come in here unless they're really, really lucky and be able to pick up credentials and execute on an attack like this. So that's another interesting angle of this too, is just how the timing plays into like whether or not it's actually accurate how they're presenting themselves.
Almost like some of the GRU affiliates, if you will, with Rush Valley, same kind of thing. Like,
yeah, totally.
They pose as, independent entities, but are wholly.
Yeah, to further the narrative of like, everyone in the country agrees with this kind of thing. But and to also obviously distract from the core actions that are taking place by the military. But yeah, it seems much more likely that it's actually sponsored by Iran at the very least.
Fair. Phyllis, anything you want to close out with?
I mean, I think, we often talk about supply chain risk as the security of your supply chain. But if you look, Intune is so pervasive. And if you look at why was Kelvin's tool also selected, supply chain is also, we need to look at it as single points of failure across huge ecosystems, right? So it's not just a supplier and that supplier security. You can see the criminals and the hackers looking at what's the most bang for their buck, right? So you saw that in SolarWinds was different. That's very unique. But, it is, you're going to target where you can get the maximum effect for minimal effort. So what's the tooling, or what's the piece of software that's most pervasive? That's what they want to go after, because then they can, reap the most benefit. And I just say Intune because everyone's using Intune. So it's like, that's kind of like, it seems like a no-brainer, but it's just also just smart, right? It's just smart.
Yeah, absolutely. Ali, one last question, probably a silly one. Expect more of this, with Iran, like not having the kinetic capabilities other than their drones, which are pretty damn effective. I read an article this weekend about, the amount we have to spend to just intercept one of those drones is pretty damn expensive with our interception tools. But your thoughts on expect more of this as, backs against the wall, don't have the kinetic force of a U.S. Capability.
Absolutely. We're definitely going to see more of this. And I do think it's so interesting because one of the things that I do in Code War is I start the book by looking at the Gulf War of all things. And like, obviously it's not like we were jumping around with a bunch of attacks in 1990. But the reason that I start there is because that is the moment that was such a major inflection point for the US military and for many different militaries to recognize the power of like information operations as a core component in multi-domain warfare. And what was so important about that is that we saw that, first off, be huge validation for the US that was the strategy that they wanted moving forward. It was also huge validation for the Russian government because they've been doing that through radio electronic combat. But it was a kick in the pants for China to be like, oh, we have to start taking this approach as well when they hadn't been already. And then the reason that I bring that up is because I end the book talking about Russia's war in Ukraine, because that to me is the demonstration of coordination with cyber attacks most effectively into a wartime scenario that we've seen. So there are a lot of lessons that we can take away from Russia's war in Ukraine that show just how effective cyber attacks can be when used in particular contexts, especially when there's significant coordination with actual military action. So espionage is part of that. Wipers all day, every day is a big part of that. And information operations, of course, and information operations are an area where Iran has done a lot of experimenting in the past. So I would absolutely expect more attacks that either leverage malware or leverage something in order to wipe systems. And then also in the information domain and, of course, for espionage.
Neat. So I just finished up, Ali, as I lead into introducing you. I was at an event this past week where they had a presenter bring on a real Enigma machine from World War II.
That's so cool.
Yeah, and it's just interesting, right? Even though cyber's evolved so much, Intel's, I shouldn't say always, Ali, but it's really been a huge part of kinetic war, right? There's this whole piece that, we were able to, after this, boat, submarine got sank, we were able to get it, start to understand how they were transmitting, their secrets and everything. So it's just, it's just an evolution, right, of the technology. And what a just timely, I'm so grateful you said yes to coming on because it's so timely and topical. First off, huge congratulations to you on a book. And my gosh, you probably couldn't have timed a better release with tomorrow with your vision of this. But please share a little bit about yourself. Love to, hear how you got into this. And then for you all out there, your involvement's critical today if you want to win one of 5 books. Compliments of Right of Boom. We'll announce the winners. Kelvin will be Caesar. He'll ultimately say yes or no, and you'll send me your email, and we'll send you out. We'll send you out 5 copies, one to each person. So, Ali, the floor is yours, and then we'll turn it over to Kelvin to open it up.
Yeah, thank you so much again for having me and for supporting the book. It means the world to me. It's been 2 years of work, so it's not a short process, but it has been very, very rewarding. I love what you said when you started this part of the conversation, where it is something that's been going on for a while. Because to your point, like one of the reasons why in Code War I go back to like BCE China is to prove that point. That ultimately this is something that is a continuation of something that has been happening for centuries and centuries. And it was really fascinating because that's kind of what I went into this book with, is this premise of, if we look back in history of these nations, we can fundamentally understand why they make the decisions with attacks and defenses that they do today. So throughout the book, I go into China, Russia, and the US to get a better sense of where they started, and then also where they're at today and how they're making decisions and evolving their operations. And I kind of do a little vignette to history in every single chapter, starting with something that could be as far back as BC China, but most of the times it's a little bit more recent. World War II, of course, comes up quite a bit. Just to give a sense for like the fact that we have been facing these same problems forever. And cyber is just a new and very powerful way of doing these types of attacks at scale, better than like throwing pamphlets out the door of the plane kind of thing, like we saw in many cases in wars past. So it was It was a lot of fun, and it's something that I've wanted to do for a long time. While you were trying to figure out the screen share situation, I mentioned that my background is as a computer engineer before becoming a hacker and then a security practitioner. And I've always kind of thought about it from this perspective of like, what is the historical reference? Of course, like in the cybersecurity industry, I've seen a number of times people be like, and if you go and look at history, you're going to be able to see that this means X, Y, and Z. But I had never seen it written out in this kind of way. So I wanted to kind of take it to that next level and bring those comparisons in. And it's also really fascinating how the governments themselves either hamstring themselves or really aid in the efforts that they're trying to push forward. The US compared to China is a great example of this, because in my mind, and like from what I saw writing this book, one of the reasons that the US is so powerful in cybersecurity is because the coordination that the US military has is so good and so strong. And so there's so much work that the US government does to coordinate really effectively compared to what you would see in like China or Russia, where like, at least with the Russian military, they're all competing for Putin's attention. And so you're going to get the two different organizations attacking the same target time and time again. In China, it's kind of a similar scenario where there's so many instances where you'll end up seeing two different Chinese hackers that are both employed by the government on the same box. No idea the other is there because they're working on maybe different operations, maybe the same operations, but there's so little coordination and such a struggle there. And we've seen that time and time again. And they've done a lot to restructure their military to try to address that. So it was really fascinating to see this come through, and I really enjoyed writing it.
Awesome. Well, again, thanks for coming on. Kelvin, I'm going to hand it to you. And again, everybody out there, awesome questions, awesome engagement, and we will start picking some winners. So let it fly, Kelvin.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest things, and I'm going to rephrase this question a little bit because
I did a horrible job.
Because you did a horrible job. Yeah. Sorry, Andrew. No, like most of the cybersecurity information that we get these days is a lot of unconfirmed chatter, blogs. It's once in a while a good white paper, a research brief. What drove you to instead write a book about specifically this entire situation? Because most of the information that we get as cybersecurity professionals is very scattered right now. And I do understand the idea of combining it all into a single location, but I'm really wondering what the motivations were behind this needs to be a book instead of another blog, another research paper, another series of 10 blogs, etc.
Yeah. To be honest, it was largely because I thought that the amount of research that it would take and the amount of space it would take to go over these was going to be so massive that at that point it wasn't going to make sense to keep it in like a single blog or something like that. And I found that very quickly, to be honest. Like when I started this book, I wanted to do 6 different threat actors. I didn't want to just do Russia, China, and the US. I also wanted to do, of course, like Iran, Israel, North Korea. Like there were so many other things I wanted to get into. And I quickly realized as I was writing it that like, we're going to go way over 100,000 words if I keep doing this. And in fact, what I submitted to the publisher was 136,000 words. And they were like, you can't have more than 96,000. Wow. So you're going to have to cut a lot of this, which we did. And to be honest, I think the book is better for it. But it is one of those things where like, there's so much history. There's so much to cover. I think I could write a book just on one of these nations and still have it be just as long with the amount of detail that you could get into. But I really wanted it to be, of course, like the 3 biggest to start with and to get a better sense of, because there's so much history with each of them. There's so much more out there. And a lot of people have asked me like, why the US as one of these? And to be honest, I think it's because we don't often treat it as an equal player from a threat actor standpoint. And I wanted to give it that due of, let's actually look at the US as a threat actor and also as a nation that is responsible to some extent for putting some level of cybersecurity controls in place, and whether those are being used for surveillance or not, like we see in China and Russia. And it was difficult, of course, given the tendency we have to have a bit of a Western bias when it comes to threat research just inherently, and just because, to be honest, a lot of times if there's research coming out of Russia or China, we can't trust it. But it was really fascinating to see how they compare and contrast. And I tried to, despite being an American and obviously having a bias to a certain extent, tried to keep it as neutral as I could.
I love that. It's funny because, like Andrew said at the start, I'm European, so I'm from the other side of the pond, and we always hear like 60% of all cyber attacks originate from the East, and then like, yeah, wait, that means we're still performing 40% of cyber attacks. Hold on a second.
Very true.
It's something to absolutely think about, and I really love how you looked at military doctrine, national history, geopolitical strategy, all of these things. What was the hardest part of that to reconcile? Like where do these worlds really start to disagree with each other? You already mentioned a little bit of like the United States or the Western view bias. That's already a hard part, of course. But like, where did it really collide for you?
So there's two areas. The first is definitely validating the reporting that's out there and making sure that I'm not making ties to things that I shouldn't be making ties to. That was very important to me as I was going through the research process, because just of the constraints of having the information that I do. But I will say that like one of the things that I kept coming back to and really had to be strategic about and think about is the perspectives within these countries. Because of course, I understand very well the perspective of being an American. I've been to Hong Kong. That's the closest I've gotten to being in China. I haven't been to Russia at all. The closest I've been is like neighboring European countries like Ukraine or Finland. And so when I was thinking about this, and since I do have friends who are from these areas, a lot of it was, how do I approach this from just an ultimately biased Western view, but try to give it its due? And so one of the things that I ended up doing is I start the book and end the book talking about the social contracts that each of these nations has with their people. And I wanted to do this in part because I kept running into this thing that I thought was so interesting, which is that even in the course of many of the surveillance states that I was seeing throughout the book, and many of the surveillance operations, there was a push in each of these countries for what the citizens of them believed was freedom, or was freedom to them. And I was like thinking about this from the American perspective of like absolute freedom, anything less is tyranny kind of thing. And I was like, what are these people talking about? How could they think that this was freedom? But in reality, and one of the reasons why I included the social contracts in the book is because if you look at Russia, for example, freedom for them looks like the ability to survive and go beyond survive and thrive in certain scenarios. They have so much trauma from the fall of the Soviet Union that they're like, put me in a situation where I'm physically safe and I don't have to stand in food lines. That's freedom to me. I'm able to move around the country. I'm able to potentially go to different states. Like, that is their version of freedom, and they're willing to trade that off if they are able to, or if the government basically has the control over them to say, this is what you are going to believe. Even if you don't agree with it inside, you're going to say that you do publicly. In China, it's a very different scenario, which is driven by, again, a lot of the trauma and a lot of the history that they have, where the focus is on freedom from the standpoint of the freedom to prosper and to have harmony. So not to be in a situation where many thousands to millions of people are dying, and whether they can live a life that they enjoy and that they're happy with. And that's their freedom and their version of freedom that is most important to them. They don't want to live in our free society in the US. They want this support from the government and to get back the ability to be comfortable in their lives and live a life that they're proud of. And so I really loved looking at this through that lens, because it changed my perspective a lot on the different controls that the citizens allow the governments to put in place from a defensive standpoint with cyber, which inevitably end up being in some way used for surveillance or other measures. And then also looking at that from the US perspective, which is, of course, what I came back to at the beginning, which is absolute freedom or anything else is tyranny. And how do you balance that with needing to implement some level of cyber defense that protects the nation? I think that was one of the hardest things for me, was to come to that conclusion and to try to think about things through that lens.
Ellie, can I ask a real quick question? Because I want to make sure John and Phyllis and everybody have time for questions for you. But one thing that comes to mind in the course of 2 years of writing this, did things change for you with the notion of Russia? Meaning, you just mentioned about all they wanted was, they'll do whatever they need to. But as I don't think they ever, this is not me saying this, but they obviously didn't understand how formidable Ukraine would put up in opposition. This was a 2-week war and it was over.
Yes.
And now hundreds of thousands of Russians have been killed as a result. And this is, this country is not going to go down without a massive fight. Did your research change over the course of that period as a result of that?
In multiple ways. And I'm so glad that you asked that, because from the first standpoint, like, I start the book with those social contracts, and then I, to be honest, end it with how each of those nations are failing in delivering the social contracts that they claim that they were going to be able to deliver to their people, and the government especially. And one of those ways is the Russo-Ukrainian war, which is you were expecting that you would be able to live relatively safely, that you weren't going to get picked up by the government and disappeared. Now you don't live like that in Russia. You may be shipped off to war at a moment's notice. And so your survival and the social contract that the Russian government established with their people of you'll be mostly left alone as long as you just repeat what we tell you to repeat doesn't exist anymore. And it's putting them in a very difficult spot, the people, and also the government, with how they address that as a core challenge. I think, to your point, the other aspect of this is the war in Ukraine has really shown the different ways where cyber attacks work and where they don't work. So a great example of this is a lot of the initial attacks that were taking place on the electric grid in Ukraine, right? There have been so many groups that are like, we're just going to take out the electric grid with a cyber attack, and that's going to be how we solve this problem. Now, that I give many examples throughout the book. Like, of course, the chapter on Ukraine is huge in the book, but I give many examples of this, and I compare them to when you hit a facility like that with a missile. Guess which one lasts longer? Guess which one lasts way longer? If you hit something with a missile, it's not coming back. If you hit something with a cyber attack, it's going to come back. Maybe it takes a couple of weeks. Maybe it takes a couple months. But what was really fascinating is, more than anything else, the Russian government and military started to approach it in a bit of a different way, which is, sure, we will hit this station with a missile, but at the same time, we're going to target them with a cyber attack, and we're going to DDoS the customer service center so that anybody trying to communicate, hey, I don't have power here, can't get through. And so that, to me, was so fascinating to see, which is, it doesn't have to be one or the other. You don't have to use one or not use the other. You can use both really effectively together to achieve an even further result than you could with just one. And then, of course, like, that's not to say it's not valuable to use cyber attacks in these use cases, because we have Venezuela as a great example, where ultimately the US didn't want to destroy a lot of equipment within Venezuela, but they wanted to take it out for a certain period of time. So that's a great use case for cyber attacks in that instance.
Yeah. John, you did a lot of coordination, as she just mentioned, in theater, not in theater. And I'm guessing Venezuela, they didn't want to blow up a lot of stuff. I was going to say shit, but they didn't want to blow up.
You say shit, it's your show.
They didn't want to blow up a lot of stuff because that's oil. But yeah, go ahead, John, your thoughts.
Yeah. No, I think you touched on something really interesting, like the kind of what I'd say is a new dimension that combines armed dilemma. That you try to put any military you're going against in that position with air and ground coordination, intel, and adding the cyber component. There's a lot of kind of debate of how much efficacy you could really get through cyber attacks in a military thing. I think it's really good for influencing. It's very good for blinding or disrupting C2 and things like that, but bombs still work better most of the time. To your point, Allie, I think thing I'm really interested in personally is, you researched that's really well, but US, Iran, China. I'm going to add a fourth one in, Andrew, which is Israel. How would you rack and stack these guys' strengths, weaknesses, and any advice, for kind of the layman out there on their own defenses? It's a big question.
Yeah. So Israel is one of those ones that I really wanted to dig into more and didn't get the chance in the book. Like, if I write another book, which is a big if, because this was such a long process and so much work, it would probably be Iran, Israel, and North Korea. Like, those are the three that I really want to tackle. Because when I think about it, like, of course, China, Russia, and the US are like top tier. I'd say second tier edging on being into the top tier is definitely Israel, of course. Like there's so much that they do so effectively when it comes to offensive cyber operations, and integrated with like actual physical kinetic warfare too is like their coordination is actually quite strong. And then North Korea and Iran floating in that second tier as well. But it is one of those areas where I want to dig in and actually do that whole history, because I think it would be so fascinating to see each piece of that.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And as far as like Russia and China and the US, is there any capabilities that you found in your research that caused the greatest concern, or that you thought they were extremely advanced, in?
I mean, of course, when we look at like the Anthropic research released last year that goes into how a Chinese state-sponsored APT was using AI agents to orchestrate as many aspects of their attack as possible, that is extremely concerning to me for all like governments, companies, everybody. That's a big problem. So it's difficult to say whether, like, they're obviously not the only threat actor that is really focused on trying to use AI to create more dynamic attacks that can kind of operate on their own and not need a human intervention to make it work, which I do think is coming and is going to happen. But that one has me the most concerned. I'd say the second is not actually a particular cyber attack at all, but is the digital Silk Road and what China is doing from the standpoint of making sure that their technology is everywhere in the world that they can possibly get it. That is a huge challenge for us, because so many of the laws that have been passed in China recently have just gained the government more and more control over the companies operating in them, to the point where, of course, like a lot of Western countries have left, but also because they are just so capable of so easily using that technology for surveillance to basically extend what they have as their walled garden into a much bigger garden that is across the world instead of within their own borders. So when I think about from a attacks and defenses standpoint, what is setting them up for future success the best, that is the biggest concern for me, is just our lack of within the US, having technology that is spreading across the world in as effective a way as China is.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with that more. I mean, their dominance of supply chain, all this stuff. I mean, you saw during COVID, I mean, we could barely get monitors here, everything we touch. And an area I think is really disturbing is like just how many critical infrastructure places have Hikvision cameras in them. They're like insecure out of the gates. They make them. I mean, you've seen what the Israelis have done in Iran with kind of penetrating some of their security camera networks. And I would say kind of like a follow on to that. One of the areas I found to be the most concerning from a, kind of a threat to the United States, like the worst type of cyber attack, was the infiltration of our internet service providers, the kind of Volt Typhoon and that type of stuff. I'm kind of curious if that came up in your research and just kind of some of your thoughts. So, for the audience, obviously we all think the cloud's just, it's magic, it happens, but you got to get there somehow. And that happens through routing and switching, which isn't talked much, but I feel like it's an area of huge concern. I'm just curious to your thoughts.
Oh, yes. That came up a lot in the book, because it is like, we're talking about this, like the walled garden that China has. A lot of the way that they manage their surveillance and their censorship is through the control that they have of the service providers. And so it is, of course, a very natural thing for them to want to immediately go to the service providers and try to gain as much access as they can. They don't even need to read the messages. They just need to know the locations, who's talking to who, like anything that they can gain there is so useful for them when, especially paired with some of these kinetic attacks. And so I have a lot of concerns about their ability to do that and our ability to appropriately defend the internet service providers, because so much of that is left to them or has been put in a very difficult position for them because of the requirements that they have, because of a lot of the surveillance issues that the US has struggled with over the years to keep certain data for extended periods of time and be able to provide access to the government for it. So it's a big concern of mine, especially when we've already seen how they can use it really effectively in their own nations. The next step is, how do I expand that walled garden.
So
yeah, I'm really glad to hear your perspective, and I'll turn it over to you, Andrew. That's, I think, to me, like the single greatest concern. As far as the United States and the West, for that matter, routers, switches, they're old the second they come out of the factory. They stay in service forever, and they don't get updated very much, and they're riddled with vulnerabilities. And it's also how you can find people. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So, yeah.
Well, thank
Andrew.
Don't worry about our firewalls, John. So.
Yeah, same networking gear. I mean, just networking equipment sucks in general. So,
Kelvin, what did you like out of those questions?
There's so many good questions coming in. It's insane. The audience engagement is so much fun today.
We're selling books for you. We've given away 4. Go ahead.
Oh,
Kelvin.
great.
There's really a couple that I really am interested in. One is by Pre-J. Does the enemy of my enemy is my friend stuff happen where there are joint operations against the West? Good example, like Russia and China working together to take down some infrastructure. Have you seen that, or does it happen?
Interesting. It does happen. I don't think that I reference any of it directly in the book, actually, but it's absolutely happening, especially from a coordination standpoint in times of war. Basically, their own version of the 5 or 10 or 15 eyes on the eastern side of things. I do think that like the things that strike me the most are not so much the coordination that happens between nations in these scenarios, but the way that they try to blame each other for cyber attacks, like a lot of the false flag operations that happen, like during the Olympics, for example, where it's like they're loose allies, right? I think that's one of the other challenges that a lot of these nations have that are outside or on the opposing side of the Five Eyes is like any alliances that you're going to get with China are going to be mostly economic, and they're going to be pretty loose. There's not a lot of like, we'll defend you if this situation happens coming from China or North Korea or anything like that. And so it makes it much more difficult for them to coordinate with another nation when so much of them is like, we'll coordinate economically, but that's about the extent that you're going to get. But I do think that like the false flag operations are really interesting and how they try to blame each other for a lot of these operations.
Very cool. That immediately leads me to Eric's question, because his question is, how much of the cyber attacking in these cases is manifesting as misinformation or disinformation rather than an actual operational shutdown? Thinking of your example about how to take down the power plant. That's yeah.
There's so much of it out there. There's a certain, like, this is a big concern for me. Like one of the sections in the book and also at the end of the book that I have is reality is believability and believability is reality. Like we've entered a post-truth era where it is a matter of like, what's the most believable? And we're kind of going down a stronger path with this after the 2016 election and after the 2020 election, in the ones in the United States, where a lot of the social media companies especially were putting in a lot more controls to make sure that they were pre-bunking and debunking when disinformation was bound to be spread, like around elections and things like that. But I have big concerns with a lot of the pullback that they've done and a lot more of the focus on less of the focus on third-party fact-checking and more of the focus on community notes. Because as good as community notes are, what we're basically accepting there is that however many people yell the loudest, that's the one we believe. That becomes our reality. There's no more objective truth. And so I do think we're going to see this be more of an issue now than it ever has been because of that. I think the biggest challenge here that a lot of these companies are, that a lot of these countries are having when they try to implement this is that now that the companies know that this is coming, they're doing some things to a certain extent to prevent the virality from happening that was happening before. Now, one of the things that I found super interesting about this is that China has struggled so much with some of their disinformation efforts and propaganda efforts outside of China, which I think is fascinating because, of course, within China, they're extremely strong there. Even if we look at like what's happening in Taiwan and what they're trying to do in Taiwan, they've bought up a lot of the newspapers there. They're doing a lot to try to control the narrative in Taiwan. But when it comes to like trying to sway Western culture, they struggle so much. And the reason that I found, or one of the big reasons that I found in the book, is because they live in a walled garden where they don't have access to Facebook. They don't have access to Twitter. They don't get the cultural context that we all have. And so people are like, we don't really understand what this is. And they kind of just move on. Of course, they have an element of this where it's like they've got so many people on this that they're constantly barraging systems, but they're not getting the virality that we saw with Russia in 2016 and 2020, which is kind of interesting.
Ali, can I just jump into Phyllis? Because you mentioned elections, and Phyllis over at CIS had, very good insight into the electoral ISAC, MS ISAC over there. Phyllis, anything come to mind as she mentioned this kind of disinformation campaigns? Not that we ever had that in our elections, but if you saw any of that kind of stuff or had any thoughts.
Oh yeah, I mean, for sure. And that's I will say elections officials are very worried about that. So, Allie's right on the money. It really was about misdisinformation. It wasn't that there were any votes that weren't counted properly, or that there was any vulnerabilities in voting machines or voting reporting. However, it speaks to consumer confidence, right? So if you don't feel like your vote mattered, or if you feel like the votes weren't counted properly, what does that mean about the validity of an election versus perhaps the truth of, yes, the votes were counted properly, this, that, and the other. It's like whoever kind of says it the loudest or tells, like, Ali said, the most believable story, they win. And one of the big things that the elections infrastructure ISAC actually helped with, kind of having like a situational awareness room, was really around, misinformation around, this voting center is closed. Don't vote. And then the elections officials would have to scramble, be like, no, it really is open. Or no, there was no bomb threat there. Please go vote. And so it's kind of like that type of whack-a-mole of that misinformation, disinformation. Everyone talk about your social contract. One of the social contracts in the US is everybody, if you're a US citizen, gets an opportunity to vote. Everybody should have an opportunity to vote. And that's a big deal for all the voting machines, all those elections officials, that everyone is able to vote. And so, they take that very seriously, and that misdisinformation really can affect that. So
one of my...
I was right on with that. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm so glad you mentioned this. No, I'm so glad you mentioned this, because one of my favorite parts in the book is actually talking about the election security angle of all of this. And I started out with the death of Edgar Allan Poe. Are any of you familiar with how he died?
Hello, I'm in Baltimore. Yes, I'm near Baltimore.
Okay, you know what's up. Okay. So it's such a fascinating story, because he showed up randomly in Baltimore. He wasn't supposed to be there. And he showed up and he was drunk and incoherent, and he was in someone else's clothes, and he was in the gutter, and he was right outside of a polling station, which was very fascinating. And so he died a couple of days later. They never figured out what exactly happened there, but one of the most enduring theories is that he died as a victim of cooping, because in the United States at that time, the voter laws were not nearly what they are today. And so what would happen, and this was 1849, is there would be people who would pick up individuals off the street. They would beat the crap out of them. They would send them in to vote for who they wanted them to vote for. And then they would do that over and over again and just change out their clothes each time to make it seem like they were different people each time. One of the biggest challenges with this is that at that time in the US, after you voted, you got a little treat of alcohol. A little shot of alcohol after you voted to say, thanks for voting. And so they would very easily get incredibly drunk if they were voting multiple times. And so a lot of people think that that is how he died, as a victim of cooping. And cooping is one of the things that led to many of the election reforms in the United States that made it so it's incredibly difficult to actually change the election count, like a lot of the disinformation out there says is happening, which is so fascinating. So one of my favorite parts of the book is I open up with that story and then talk about a lot of the election security challenges that we've had in the past. But to Phyllis's point, it's so true, where it's actually quite difficult to alter the results because of a lot of the reforms that happened through cooping and because of a lot of other elements in the United States.
Ali, what happened to Edgar Allan Poe is very similar to me and Kelvin in Vegas after Right of Boom, but we did survive. Although Yeah, that's all I do want to talk about. But the eerie similar, Kelvin, story of Edgar Allan Poe.
Yeah, it was like she was talking just about us.
Yeah, fascinating. Phyllis, let's go to a few of your questions here.
Yeah, sure. So, we often talk about living off the land attacks here on this web series, and so we have nation state operators hiding inside, of course, legitimate tooling. I mean, we'll see what they have to say about Intune later. But essentially, attackers using your own tools or services against you. So if you put that into perspective with Iran, where they're using cyber as a primary weapon, how high is the risk that trusted platforms that we're using here become an attack vector for this kind of attack and for pre-positioning for these organizations?
Yeah, I think to your point, the third-party risk angle of this is really important. There's a lot of potential for it to be used in that way, especially like through so many cyber attacks that we've seen have global implications. It started with very small companies that, to be honest, probably never would have expected that their software would have been targeted by an attack because they're too small or too quiet of a company. But in reality, they're the perfect entry vector because they are so much smaller, have such fewer resources, and can be such a bigger target. It's one of the reasons why, like, in a lot of the conversations that I have, especially with companies that are on the smaller side, I'm like, you need to work with some type of service provider that has threat intelligence, that understands the threat landscape, because they don't have the resources to address this. Like, that's one of the core problems, is they don't have the resources that they need to resolve a lot of these attacks. And quite frankly, like, they're running a business. That's not what their focus is or necessarily should be, but they still need to do a level of the bare minimum to make sure that they are protected and that their organization is protected and their customers ultimately. So I got so into that I completely forgot the question. But did that answer the question?
You're talking about living off the land with Iran.
Oh, yes, thank you.
The probability of it happening.
But
yes.
After you answer, Ali, John, feel free to chime in here. I mean, this is the whole premise of what you did, coming out of nation state type of, warfare and things like that. Why your premise? So feel free to chime in after Ali.
Yeah. There's
we'll let Ali
go for it.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, absolutely. I think the other thing is, like, thinking about this from my background as a hacker, like, we were using whatever was already on the machine by nature, because why build something when you don't have to, especially if it's already going to be on the machine that you're targeting. And so I do expect that will continue, both from a third-party supply chain standpoint, but also from just a, hey, is there a tool on the machine that we can use that it's going to be effective? Like, at the end of the day, it doesn't need to be a sophisticated attack. Like, if you're building a sophisticated attack for the sophisticated attack's sake, then it's probably more of an ego thing than like a necessary evil to get the job done. And sometimes it's sometimes you got to do it in a way that just gets the job done.
Yeah, I think
for sure. John, any thoughts on this?
I think things are like, there was a period of time when you could get into almost anything and get away with it, but a lot of, defense is a lot more knowledge is out there about how this game is played. Now, there's obviously some very special stuff that's not out there, but I think the premise of what we did when we invented our software is, like, step one, I want to see live credentials, privileged ones, used and put it in context, either good guy or bad guy. It's really simple. And then you can enrich it with a lot of other data sources. But I think, at the end of the day, nation state, criminal group, whatever, you want to use your golden exploits very sparingly, right? And you want to use really sophisticated implants, I think, a little bit more sparingly now than back in the day, because if it looks really spooky and it gets probably really spooky, and it tends to unearth a lot of stuff and be pretty. So I think there's probably a big trend to, like, continue to live off the land a lot more, and there's frankly a lot more opportunities to do it these days, and it's a lot easier. So to me, I would say, the golden hammer for when you use everything you can to hide in plain sight. And I believe that in undercover operations too. It's better to be a business person, hiding in plain sight wherever you are, if you have to operate these days, because it's so easy to get caught now with biometrics and everything else. I think the corollaries are really similar there.
Cool. All right, Phyllis, how about another one with you? And then John, do you have any good stuff left after
I mean,
Phyllis?
I just have a question that's a little bit, it's totally off script, if that's okay.
So is my next one.
I mean, it's really,
We've already identified my questions by Kelvin's just crap. So let's go on here.
I mean, I think what's interesting, of course, is like just my background and John's background. Non-attribution is huge, right? And so many, the low and slow really has to talk. It really is about attribution. You don't want to be detected, all those types of things. Did you go it used to be China was just smash and grab. Like they didn't care. They could care less if you attributed any attack to them. They're like, I'm just going to get what I want because I can. So did you see that at all in your book? Like, Russia also, they're pretty sophisticated. A lot of the stuff was not, they don't want to have that attribution as well. Did you go into that at all? I mean, I know here in the US, of course, as a nation state, we want to be undetected as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I go into that in the book a lot because especially with the countries that are facing sanctions, like at a certain point, we're not going to sanction them more. So they might as well just who cares about attribution at that point? Because even attribution is another geopolitical tool that you can use to your advantage or choose not to use. And so in this context, a lot of times there reaches a point where these nations are like, what are they going to do? They got nothing new that they can do to us. So we might as well go ahead and execute the cyber attack and the consequences be damned kind of thing. And of course, they're going to deny it anyway. But that happens a lot with Russia. It happens a lot, of course, with North Korea. And so in a lot of those contexts, it's very fascinating to see because when you start thinking about cyber attacks as core levers that you can use beyond the more traditional means of national power, then it comes into context why a nation eventually stops caring about something like this and starts being like, yeah, this is what we're going to do and you're going to deal with the consequences. I mean, to be honest, we're seeing that with the US now too. It's not like the US was particularly quiet about what they did in Venezuela with cyber attacks. And so I expect that, and especially given the national security strategy focused on cyber that the Trump administration released, I think it was 2 weeks ago now, we're going to see more offensive attacks and they're not going to be quiet. They're going to be loud. And it's one of the biggest concerns that I have for a lot of US based or publicly traded businesses is the fact that the louder that the US gets with offensive cyber attacks, the more vocal they are about the attacks that they're perpetrating, the more retaliation that's going to take place. And it's not just target the US military.
That's definitely a huge policy change.
Yes.
I will just have that. That's all I'll say. But
the cyber tech tools don't blow up. So you reverse engineer, recover, and then you give it to the rest of the world. That's another big issue. I guess so. The wiper ones are good. They're easy. They work.
You mentioned that I'm just going to go back. You mentioned that these end organizations, you recommend that they rely on CSPs to help detect some of these things. Is that where you're going to, this is full of MSPs. What is it that we can help? What are the top 2 or 3 things? And this was a question asked in the chat that you recommend MSPs can do. Go ahead. Sorry, Andrew.
Yeah, I'm just going to mention, in fairness to Allie, she had one request of me. She has a meeting at the top of the hour.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I would love to continue this for another hour.
Yeah, would love to have you back, Allie. But one thing I do want to mention to everybody out there is first, thanks a million. I'm going to put something in. Let me see if this all goes into chat effectively. Okay. So what we're going to do, Allie, we gave away $5. 2 people saw the message to me, and that's I re-put it in there. But here's what we're going to do, Allie. We're going to give away 5 more. What you need to do if you want to win is go out on LinkedIn, tag Allie. There's her URL in LinkedIn. Write a boom. There's where you can watch it, the YouTube or the LinkedIn, and tag 5 friends. And then Allie and I will communicate, and we'll give away 5 more. Allie, any closing thoughts and comments? And again, congratulations. We'll definitely have you back on if you would be so inclined to join us.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I would love to. I mean, I think in closing and kind of related to Phyllis's last question here, the most important thing that organizations can do today is having very regular geopolitical risk conversations with the security organization as a part of them. I'm talking like at least once a quarter, but in reality, it should be taking place as frequently as the dynamics on the ground are changing. This is a inflection point for how cyber attacks are going to be used in warfare. It happened in the Russo-Ukrainian war, and we're going to see that happen even more now. And the geopolitical situation is not going to slow down. And so it's very important that we are constantly aware of what's changing, what's happening, and how we can best address it in the moment and where our potential risk lies. So I highly recommend that for everyone if you have the resources to do so. And if you don't, then to use a service provider to help support that.
Great advice, Allie. Let Phyllis and team stay on. Allie, let you get to your next meeting. Have a great day. Great success on the book. We'll be in touch. Take care.
Bye. Thanks so much for having me, everyone.
Wonderful having you.
Thank you.
So I think her last comment was awesome, right? But interesting, Kelvin, as you know, we are in this era with MSPs of vCISO, right? And this is a governance conversation at best. We got to get people to care. How do you think about talking to clients that might have supply chain risk and could be, they're doing business with Israel, hypothetically? How are you broaching that? When 70, let's just say 40, 50, 60% of their business comes from Israel. Hey, this is an important conversation now.
This is actually a conversation that we're having today with a lot of European private equity people. Private equity has to look at what in Europe is called the DORA regulations, the Digital something Resilience Act. I forgot, Digital Operational Resilience Act. They have to be resilient. And one of the questions that came across our desk recently was a statement by the EU made that Microsoft might not be a trusted party because they are in the USA. And with all the geopolitical conflicts right now, that is a danger to financial resilience. So that was an actual question that one of the PE guys had to us, like saying, should we have a sovereign cloud solution? So it is a very active subject that I still don't have the right answer for my clients either, no matter what place it is, if it is the United States or if it is Israel or if it is Russia. We have clients that currently supply, and this is manufacturing, so just they supply rags and fabrics to Russia, which is not under current embargo, but still it is a thing that they have to think about, like, what if next week it is? So I don't have a right answer for it yet, because MSPs are in a very challenged position right now. Like, how do I help my clients and still sort of maintain the status quo? Because I don't want everyone to make reactions just based on fear. Yeah. It's a very difficult conversation to have.
Yeah, it's really good advice. Really good advice. All right, I know we're over the hour. John, thanks for being a guest co-host and sharing tonight. It was awesome having you 2 weeks back to back, and great seeing you, my friend. Glad you're feeling better.
Yeah.
Phyllis, as always, great seeing you. Kelvin, thanks again for staying up. I know it's getting later there, and really appreciate the insight. Everybody out there, thank you. And again, if you were a winner, make sure you send me an email at andrew@writeaboom.com. We'll see you next week.